welcome everyone today. And I want to say a big thank you to the Trivandi Academy because I'm so excited that an organisation is actually kind of leading the charge on bringing wellbeing to the events industry, because I think all of those of us who've been in it for a while know that the need is there and that it's not currently really being addressed. So happy to see that it is now. But today our focus is just really about how the brain works and the power of our thoughts, and just exploring how our thoughts shape our reactions and our stress levels and our anxiety as well. And so my intention is to try and bring this to life as much as possible. So rather than just sharing slides with you today, is just how does this show up for us physically and mentally? So I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs for you now. And as best as you can, I just ask that you kind of try to embody what it is when you hear these sentences, okay? And by that, I mean really try and put yourself in the shoes of the person, and try and kind of get a sense of what thoughts are coming up for you and notice anything that's coming up for you in the body as well. So just a couple of paragraphs. You're an event or venue professional. Last night, you made a big mistake with some event registrations, which meant a corporate group couldn't get in when they should have been allowed to. Mid-morning, you offer to get your team some coffees down the street. On your return, you notice your boss on the other side of the road. You smile and wave. However, your boss does not respond. Your boss continues to walk past you without giving you any reaction. So just taking a moment there to kind of think about the thoughts that have come up for you and anything in the body. Sometimes we get a physical sensation that might go with those thoughts as well. So you can see there that even with just that couple of paragraphs, it's created a scene that for all of us, we've interpreted a little bit differently perhaps, okay? Even though it's the same set of circumstances, we've all kind of taken a different look at how that shows up for us. So what that kind of indicates is the point is that stress starts in the mind. So, and it's largely based off how we perceive things. And how we're connecting the dots. So in this case, we made a mistake, our boss doesn't see us, kind of compounding that has given us a certain thought or a reaction to that moment. And it's only been since the 60s that they've really started to understand it's the role of thoughts and the role of the mind that really kind of sets the stress reaction into play. So a quick note about how stress works, and I should be clear, we're going to kind of set the foundation today and learn a bit about how stress in the brain works, and then follow up obviously with more practical kind of sessions in the future. But how stress works. So we have that mental or emotional trigger, in this case, our boss over the other side of the road, but also it's what happened the day before, isn't it, that kind of provides that trigger. And that sets in motion a train of events. So the brain will respond to that, and the brain is kind of hardwired, if you like, to detect a threat. And that's kind of a primeval response or primitive response that comes to us. And when we detect a threat, that's when we send a message to the body. And that's when we start to get a physiological response or a physical response. And that's when the body prepares for fight or flight, as you've probably heard. So fight or flight is when the body is in the sympathetic nervous system. And we prepare to fight or run, because that's traditionally in the past how we would have been prepping ourselves to respond. And so the body doesn't know, for instance, what is a real threat and what is a perceived threat. It actually, all of this happens in the same way, regardless. And then what happens when we physically respond is that can then send a message back to the brain, I'm stressed, okay? So the brain can send a message, the body sends the message, and we kind of get into this loop. Unless, as we kind of heard before, unless we train ourselves to get into the art of reframing or seeing things a different way. So that's how kind of stress comes to play. So when you are struggling with wellbeing at work, who do you speak to? But do you speak to a manager or a supervisor? Do you speak to a peer or another team member somewhere in your team? Do you speak to a family, friend member, or do you not speak to anyone when you experience symptoms of anxiety? So if our perception is shaping our thoughts a certain way, speaking to someone can give us that other frame of reference, if you like, and it helps to kind of counterbalance. So it's good to see that all of you are speaking to someone, um, generally speaking. And then the other thing is, I'm not seeing many of you speak to your managers, actually, or a supervisor at work. And the research supports that. So only 28% of event professionals discuss feelings of being overwhelmed with their employers, fearing it wouldn't lead to positive outcomes. And I think we probably all understand how that happens in the industry is that it's an environment that kind of thrives on the can-do attitude, the long hours, the pitching in, and the teamwork. So for us to kind of put up our hand and say that perhaps we're struggling, it kind of seems counterintuitive, doesn't it, to how we're kind of all being taught to show up, I guess, and in that learned environment. So really curious to see that that's only about a quarter of people. And for those of you on this call who are in positions of managerial or supervisory roles, is kind of maybe reflect on that as well and reflect on how you can possibly show up to create that psychologically safe environment where your team does feel comfortable coming to you to talk about some of these things, because that's really important. And that's really kind of where well-being starts, isn't it, in terms of cultural safety. Okay, so we'll switch gear a little bit and look at the signs of anxiety and burnout. And the reason I'm going to spend some time on this is because it's really helpful for our own self-awareness to understand what the signs are and to try to recognize them in ourselves. And then also to be kind of a good peer, if you like, and support our teammates. So, if we notice that other people might be showing some of these symptoms or signs, how can we support them? And again, create that kind of trickle environment and that safe environment everyone can kind of thrive in more and more. So anxiety is very much related to thoughts. Okay, so it's very much excessive worry or fear. And a lot of that comes with worrying about things in the future or ruminating about things that happen in the past potentially. When anxiety starts to become an issue is when the duration lasts longer than you might expect. So it's very common for us all to be anxious when we're doing an event at some stage in the event. If we've got 20 guests arriving in 10 minutes and we find we've only got 19 passes, that creates a state of anxiety, doesn't it? We're kind of like, oops, we need to fix this somehow. So there's always things that will create anxiety. The difference is how quickly we can recover from that sense of anxiety. So if we take, days or weeks where we still feel anxious about that episode or that situation, then that's when anxiety starts to impact on our daily functioning and become a bit of an issue for us. So things like overthinking and irritability come with anxiety, fatigue, headaches, stomach issues. And the reason stomach issues is because during an event, we're often just running on adrenaline and cortisol. Okay, so adrenaline to kind of keep that autopilot going. And then cortisol is the stress response. And that is what puts digestion on hold and immunity on hold. So that's why often at the end of an event we get sick. But we also might experience a lot of digestive issues when we're on site too. And that's kind of that cortisol hormone. We've also got avoidance, procrastination, and sleep issues. And of these, people typically talk about sleep more than any of the others. So that's a bit of a flag. If you hear someone complaining about sleep for a prolonged period of time, that might be a moment to just say, hey, do you want to check in? How's everything going? And then lastly, in some cases, you might experience a panic attack. And possibly some of us have had colleagues or ourselves experience that on site. Now, burnout is essentially, it's really getting to the end. So it's really getting to a state of kind of shutdown, I would say. And definitely having been there myself, it's kind of a hard line, if you like. So we can often work while we're sick. We can often do a lot while we're kind of not 100%. But burnout is that moment where it's just, nope, body says no more. And you really can't push through it when you get to that point. So it's a state of complete kind of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. And this is created by prolonged or chronic stress. So in an event context, for those of us who jump from event to event, we're kind of the key candidates, I guess, to fit into this kind of model. It's when we don't get the recovery that we can find ourselves in burnout. It's also too when we work for central organizations. So organizations like the IOC, IPC, UEFA, FIFA, that have kind of rolling events. People like Trivandi that work on multiple events, Iluka agencies that work on multiple events at the same time. So if you're in that situation, this is probably you're more susceptible to burnout because you're just not getting that recovery time. If you typically do one event and then you have a couple of months off before the next, then this may not present as much because you are getting kind of 2 to 3 months potentially in between gigs. And that gives you a sense of recovery, but in some cases, just be aware it might be kind of a false level of recovery because lying on a beach for a couple of weeks, you might think, great, I'm getting the rest I need. But if you're not resting the mind, and if you're not addressing some of the stress factors that perhaps got you to that point of exhaustion, then you will find that when you go back into work, it's still kind of it's lingering. So it's really important to address burnout. For me, it started with jet lag. I was doing a lot of long haul flights. It was when the Asian Games were all on at the same time. So there was Pyeongchang, Tokyo, and Beijing. And I was flying from Vancouver back and forth. And then I was also flying to Switzerland, which was where my host company was at that time. And that jet lag, I didn't have enough time to recover from. I was traveling so frequently, I wasn't getting enough time to bounce back. And jet lag led to insomnia. Insomnia led to not exercising, and not exercising led to not eating. And it was a bit of a spiral, if you like. So I lost a lot of weight. I developed a hacking cough. And then I just found that I couldn't go on in the end. So it's coupled by emotional exhaustion, that fatigue and kind of not feeling like you can cope. Depersonalization or cynicism, so starting to become really negative or cynical about either the work itself or even about your colleagues. And then reduced personal accomplishment, so feeling like whatever you're doing is not enough somehow, that it's not contributing, and why am I bothering? That kind of a sense of feeling. So that's what burnout is. And the longer you leave it, of course, the longer your recovery. So again, the earlier you can detect this, the better you are at kind of coming out the other side of it quickly as well. How do we avert reactivity? Because when the adrenaline, the cortisol's going as it is during events, we need to kind of find a way to step back from that at times. And what I say is choose a more conscious response. So instead of reacting to everything and allowing our thoughts to kind of run wild, how do we become aware of what our thoughts are, take the pause, and then more consciously respond? So the first step in this process is awareness. So it's awareness that my thoughts are negative. It's awareness that maybe I'm irritable, that kind of thing, and bringing awareness to what your symptoms are. And then it's finding a way to pause. So taking a very intentional and conscious pause. I know that I'm, struggling with a negative thought pattern. How can I kind of deal with that in this moment? So it might be stepping back and doing some breath work, EFT, as Lynn said. Someone in the chat said going into nature. So there's various ways you can achieve that pause. And basically, I would encourage you, whether you know it now or not, is to investigate or explore what that is for you, because that will be different for everyone in terms of what works best. And then when you have that pause, you get a chance to kind of regather and center yourself, if you like, and then choose that conscious response. So you definitely get to choose a better way of dealing with the situation. And as Lynn said, it might not be immediately, it might be shortly after. You might have to process for a while before addressing something. So this is how we move out of autopilot and into conscious response. Our next session, we've been talking about symptoms, we've been talking about burnout and anxiety and things that, tricks that our mind plays on us. We're going to spend the next session talking about kind of the positive aspect of what is now neuroscience. So many of you will have heard about this in the last decade, 2 decades. Neuroscience is getting a lot more traction. And what this essentially means is that we can rewire our brain. And it was thought for a very long time that, our patterns are so ingrained that we can't really do much about them, but that's actually not the case. And so neuroplasticity tells us that we can rewire our brain and we can change the outcome of our thoughts with practice. So we think of neural pathways in this sense as being, I always use the analogy of a footpath. So if we're walking along the road, we're on a footpath and it's cemented because we use it a lot. If we cut across the playground, though, for instance, to get to a certain building, then we start to wear down the grass eventually, don't we? And then over time, that might become so well worn and everyone's using it that maybe the council decides to footpath that instead. And you can think of that as building new neural pathways. It's kind of the same process, if you like. So the more we do something, the more consistently we practice, the more we create a new neural pathway. And that's essentially how all of this operates. So we'll go through some common thinking traps first, and then we'll look at how we flip this on its head kind of thing. So as I go through these common ones, is maybe take a moment to just reflect on anything that resonates for you, and try to pull out your default style because we tend to default to one or two of these. And again, it's about building the awareness so that we can then take the pause and respond. Catastrophizing, so always thinking of the worst, that kind of thinking trap. Filtering. So I find that we sometimes in the events field tend to default to this one a little bit. So filtering is focusing on the negative and not the positive. So for instance, if you're conducting a workforce training session, and maybe there's a sea of faces in front of you, and 99% of them have smiles on their face and they're nodding along. But then there's kind of one guy up the back who's maybe kind of nodding off potentially. And so what we might do is kind of focus on that one person who is perhaps tired for completely other reasons, rather than the sea of positive in front of us. So that's essentially filtering. There's tunnel vision, so kind of that one way or the highway kind of view of the world. All or nothing, which is otherwise known as black or white. And this is not being able to kind of process in the grey. So really thinking in kind of polar opposites. Fortune telling. So this is when we start to kind of forward think, if you like, but usually it's got a negative spin on it. So it's thinking forward, but thinking almost like catastrophizing to the kind of the worst end of the scale. Mind reading. So this was a good example of the walking down the street scenario I used at the beginning. So we're walking along, the boss is over the other side of the road. If we're thinking negative things at that point, we're really using that mind reading thinking trap, and we're thinking the worst. Emotional reasoning. So this is something where, our thoughts mirror our feelings, which is not always the case. So I often think of this as, if you're a freelancer, for instance, and you're in between event gigs, this is somewhere where this might play out. So it's kind of that thinking, I'm unemployed right now, and then kind of making the jump to feeling like you're always going to be unemployed, even though we know that's not going to be the case. So it's falling into that trap. And that comes with the uncertainty of that period. And then lastly, overgeneralizing. So this is kind of taking one event and then kind of extrapolating that all events are the same. So not necessarily one event in its entirety, but a situation within an event. So perhaps it's day one of an event and you've got, several car parks. Maybe car park one doesn't get used on day one of the event, and you overgeneralize that that's going to be the case for every other day. So let's reassign that car park, which might not be the case because we don't necessarily know what is planned for the rest of the week. So one thing we can do is when we bring awareness to our thinking trap, is thinking back to that sequence of steps. We then pause, okay? So take a moment to reflect. Now that I have the awareness that I've fallen in, what do I need to do to pull myself out of it? And this is where conscious response kicks in. So the or reframing technique, I like this one because it's very short and easy to remember. It's just a 3-letter acronym. So the first part of it is to observe. So this is the awareness piece, is being aware and observing your thoughts. The second part is to argue or look for evidence that disputes your thoughts, okay? That it gives you another perspective, another alternative. And then lastly, we work to replace the thought. So instead of the negative thought that might have popped up, we need to try and flip that on its head and come up with something that's either positive or neutral even, because neutral will still work better for us than something negative. So again, if we use the walking down the street example, observing, so we might be saying, I'm thinking my boss is angry with me because of my mistake last night. So that's the mind reading thinking trap that we've fallen into. And then argue, we might say, wait a minute, my boss wasn't wearing their glasses. Maybe they didn't even see me. Or maybe they were lost in thought. And that was something a few of you had already come to that conclusion about. And then we can replace it with something else. So why don't I suspend my judgment and when I see my boss next, mention it and just see what comes up? Okay. So that final replacement thought, it's not necessarily positive, but it's quite neutral. And it's enough that it kind of puts the stop sign off. And instead of our thoughts kind of snowballing, it's enough to say, okay, we're done with that thought. We'll deal with it when we see our boss the next time. Okay. So that's the idea is you take yourself on this journey, awareness, pause, and I'm choosing to respond very differently in this situation rather than react. So this is an interesting thing about thoughts itself. So it's estimated that an average person has over 60,000 thoughts daily. So that's a lot. And with 90% of them being repetitive. So again, that's a lot of repetition. And more often than not, they're negative. Okay. So it's a lot of negative thoughts potentially that we've got kind of churning around in our minds. And one of the reasons this is the case is that we all have what's called an inherent negativity bias. So this shows up for everyone, but we can be very proactive in managing our negativity bias. And so again, if you look at the cartoon, it's that whole, the heart says to the brain, look, and there's all these good things happening over one side. And the brain's got the magnifying glass out. Not now, heart, can't you see I'm busy? And focusing on that one bad thing, that filtering mind trap. And research shows that you need up to 5 positive interactions to counter every negative interaction. And when you think about that, that's a lot actually. So 5 to 1. So as managers, we can think about how proactively can we help our team to counter any negativity. So if you know that one person in your team has done something, they're feeling quite bad about it, how can you perhaps show up in that moment to help to counter the negativity bias with something else? And I caveat that by saying that it needs to be genuine. We can't just kind of make things up because any disingenuous activity will be known and you lose trust over it. But just, how as a manager can we kind of jump in perhaps and insert some positivity into a situation? And otherwise, as an individual, how can I show up and counter that myself? And there's a few ways we can do that. So 3 good things is a really simple practice. And it's literally, as it says, thinking of 3 good things that have happened. So I like to do this at the end of a shift or in the planning phase, simply at the end of my day. Okay. And it's literally, as the name suggests, just thinking 3 good things that happen in the day. And it doesn't need to even be related to you. It could be that, I got to watch a gold medal event. That was one good thing. I problem solved a seating solution for a kid. That's 2 good things. So it can be anything really minor, but just something that was positive, and the more you start to do this with consistent practice, you'll start to see it builds a more positive outlook as well. Gratitude ping pong. So this is something you might want to do with a team. So in the planning phase or even kind of operationally, perhaps with volunteers, but think of, what are you grateful for? And that starts a chain around the table, for instance. So if you've got everyone sitting around the table, what am I'm grateful for X, and then you just go around and do a couple of rounds of that. And I guarantee you'll start to see the smiles come and it really does lift the mood. It's quite a good infectious activity. And then I particularly like this one, I guess because of my freelancing past for the most part of it, but the applause file. So this is essentially a record of everything positive associated with your work or life. You could even add life to it. So think of thank you notes people have written to you, think of team photos, think of little gifts that you've got from, spectators, participants, countries, NOCs, for instance, anything like that that gives you a positive vibe, collected in one place. And then particularly if you're between events or if you're having a bad day, you can kind of pull that out and kind of be buoyed by past experience, okay? And knowing that you've contributed in the past, knowing that you've been good in your role, knowing that you've made friends and connections on site and so forth, okay? So that can be really useful. And particularly as a freelancer, that period in between events, as we know, is full of uncertainty. And that can create a lot of self-doubt. So having a file that you can kind of look at to remind yourself of how good you are essentially can be really useful. Overwhelm. So I think this shows up a lot on site as well, both in the planning and in the execution phase. So overwhelm for events can happen for a number of reasons, but I think a lot of it stems to people, as we kind of mentioned before, but more specifically stakeholders and clients, okay? So trying to do that delicate balance of managing stakeholder needs and keeping everyone happy. And I think a lot of us in the events industry, we tend to be perfectionists. We want to create a great experience for our clients, our end users, but we also want to keep people happy to the extent that we can too. And so those two things can create a lot of overwhelm because sometimes they're not always aligned. You know, we might have to make decisions that disappoint one group over another, and that can create some overwhelm. So some of the strategies here, I like to use Covey's work here, which you're all probably familiar with this, but the circle of concern, circle of influence, and circle of control. And one of the things we want to be really conscious of here is trying to really shift our mindset to that circle of control as much as possible. Okay. So really focus on what's within my control and what can I do. Circle of influence, a little bit less so, but circle of concern, that's the kind of thing you either delegate or you kind of let it go. And that's usually something that, you know, you shouldn't really have your nose in anyway, necessarily. So it's a good thing to kind of leave out of the equation. So think of Covey's circles and where your thoughts are fitting, you know, in which bucket there. Just checking the time. So list making, I think as event organizers, we always make a lot of lists. But lists are really important because particularly when we're in event mode, we're operational, and there's so many things churning around in our mind, it can get cluttered, okay? And the more we keep it in our mind, the less structure our thoughts will have. So the more you can put that onto a list, the more structure you can give it, and you can start to see which bucket here it falls into and make decisions about what you keep and what you discard. And then you can also start to prioritize, and you can also start to group some of your like tasks together. And that's super helpful instead of it all just kind of moving around in the mind unstructured. Start anywhere. So this was an interesting piece of research that said a lot of the time overwhelm is created not because we've got too much on our plate, but because we don't know where to start. So starting anywhere helps to alleviate that. And one thing you might like to do is start with the low-hanging fruit. So instead of going for the big ticket item, start with something small, and that kind of builds a few small wins that you can then platform into the bigger items that might be on your list. And then lastly, bridge the gap between intention and action. So the important thing to remember is as soon as we take action, we start to move ourselves out of overwhelm. So the more we procrastinate, the more we actually contribute to the cycle of overwhelm and anxiety. So when I say closing the gap here, one thing we can look to do is perhaps schedule activities in our diary. So instead of, you know, I've got a whole lot of things on my to-do list, let's create actions. Let's put each of those to-do items into our diaries and actually make the time for them. And that will help to create that action, create that forward momentum. So there's a lot that we've covered, and we'll give you another opportunity to share shortly. But I just want to try and kind of bring all of this together in terms of quick wins. And I think the interesting thing about well-being is it's not a quick fix, but it is a simple thing to enact, okay? It just requires a bit of preparation. So one of the clear things we need to do is be really clear on our why. You know, what's our intention around well-being? If we are genuinely committed to coming out of an event happy and healthy, if you like, functioning well, then we need to be very clear about what's our why and approaching it with some effort. So committing to the effort of change, okay? We do need to factor time in for this, and I know we're very poor at during events, but it's kind of quality over quantity at this point. And then acknowledging the option for choice. So it's really kind of acknowledging that we have two choices always. We can react, which is from that place of autopilot, or we can respond, which is that choice that comes from a more grounded, centered way of being. And we can cultivate that over time. So we always have choice. Execution. So in terms of implementing this, so the first thing I would suggest to people is build your self-awareness, because you can't move through that sequence without the first step. So you need to start to understand, what are my patterns of thinking? What are my patterns of behavior? What are my symptoms that show up? What thinking traps do I fall into? And once you start to recognize these, you can then start to pause and be more conscious in response. Some of the ways you can do this is a regular self-check-in. So what you can do is at the beginning of the day, for instance, is set an alarm on your phone. Every 3 hours, set an alarm. And then when that alarm goes off, is just spend 60 seconds, that's all, just sitting quietly to yourself, taking a deep breath perhaps, and just checking in with your mind and your body. You know, what's showing up for you? Do you have negative thoughts at the moment? Do you have tension in the body, which is probably reflective of something that's not 100%? So it's just making that check in and being very deliberate about, okay, I'm going to do this. What do I notice? Journaling, and I can't rate journaling highly enough, actually. So journaling is really beneficial because it allows us to process our thoughts. So if we're having thought patterns show up, we can start to process those in writing. And also we start to see those patterns. You know, if we start to journal every day, we can start to rifle through and see, you know, what's coming up that's consistent, you know, and that builds our self-awareness as well. And then we can also co-opt a buddy. So I saw in the chat someone said that they, you know, they talk to their besties at events. They have someone on site that they already talk to. So some of you are perhaps already doing this, but just having someone you can check in with, you know, and be very candid and, you know, very open and honest with, essentially, and just, you know, they can hold you accountable if you like. So if you start to slip in any way, they can let you know. And likewise, you can reciprocate. So that can be really useful. I would also start to proactively schedule time for well-being. And this is where we all kind of think, you know, this is the hard part really, isn't it? It's we're all time poor. How do we fit this in? You don't need a lot of time. So what I would suggest is in the planning phase of an event, set good habits. And once you have a really good base, that will translate into operational mode in smaller increments. Okay. So if you want to build a habit of meditation in advance, you might want to do 20, 30 minutes in the planning phase if you can. But then at games time or event time, if it's only 5 minutes, that will still count because you've got a solid base coming into the event. And that 5 minutes should really be enough to have you kind of fall into that state of more centered thinking and more relaxation. Okay. So this is something I've been doing in events now is, you know, I tend to spend 5 minutes doing meditation, maybe 10 minutes doing stretching in the morning. And that's all about kind of getting my head out of thinking mode and into more being mode and breathing. And then in the evening is trying to journal. Okay. And so that gives you, and again, that's 5 minutes. Journal any thoughts that you kind of struggle with during the day and how you might approach that tomorrow, for instance. And then a gratitude practice as well. So literally looking at 5, 10 minutes in the morning and in the evening. And no matter how tired you are, this can be really beneficial. I've done this when I really don't feel like it, and I'm always grateful that I do, is what I find. And then you might like to experiment too with a response plan that will work for you. So looking at, you know, when I notice mind reading thoughts, for example, I will do some breath work and I will choose to suspend my judgment. Okay. So something along those lines to give you a really clear response plan. Once you know what your patterns are, is try and build that response plan around it. And this will very much, I mean, I know, you know, just looking at it now, it will feel quite mechanical initially, but the more you practice with something like this, the more it will just start to become ingrained with you and second nature. So hopefully there's a few little insights there that can kind of help you through the event period. Our thoughts are transient, and it's really important to remember that we are not our thoughts, and thoughts are not facts. Okay, they come and they go. So if we imagine thoughts like buses and we're at the bus stop, we don't need to get on the bus. Okay, if the negative thought bus comes through, we can sit on the bus stop. All right, wait for the positive bus to come.